Well, today we've talked a lot about the future, a lot about artificial intelligence, about data, and we're going to spin it a little bit and talk a little bit about the media industry and how we deal with those issues. We have had to, it's been the Wild West for our products for the last 20 years or so. You know, Hollywood is somewhat antiquated. Traditionally, it wasn't a tech industry, and now you see these studios with technology company, with engineers and building these teams, product teams, and having to build roadmaps that are just not traditional for the way that we used to build content for films in the past. And we're very fortunate today to have the builders that are dealing with these problems, and not only dealing with them for the last 10 years and today, but also for the next. How are we dealing with these problems? How are we dealing with integrating new technologies? So I'd love to bring out some of the product leads and technology leaders that will be on our panel today. First, we have Brian Barber, who is the Vice President of Digital Initiatives at Warner Brothers, where he focuses on digital entertainment content. Brian, please join us. Next, we have Rohith Nandagari, who is the Director of Technology at Time Warner. He has worked on various digital and OTT platforms, including HBO, Turner, and Warner Brothers. And finally, we have John Dax, who is the Chief Digital Officer at Epix. He leads the digital team in building their premium digital products and user experiences, and collaborates with digital distribution partners to pioneer authentication across all devices and platforms. John? All right, great. I'm going to sit here with you guys. So what I think is most interesting is having to deal with what I call the Wild West of the last few years, where business initiatives come down and we're the ones on the ground floor who have to actually figure out how to plug everything together. And we have to deal with budgets and expectations, and the users are expecting everything to work perfect. And that's unbelievably challenging. And it doesn't end. Every couple years, something new comes out, and we have to be the ones who figure out how to do it and how to do it right. And I'd love to understand how you guys have dealt with integrating new technologies in the past, and maybe some key examples of how to prepare for really great integration moving forward in the future. John, how have you dealt with that, and how have you made it so that the timelines don't get out of control, budgets don't get out of control, but you're still delivering on the expectations for the business?
Sure, great question. It's funny, you said every few years something happens. I remember longingly back when that was the case, and obviously now, I mean, it's literally every few days there is some new product that we have to deal with, and I can only imagine like 20 years from now it's going to be like several times a day probably. And so for me and for our team at Epix, we've invested in building our own platform. We build our own apps by and large. We do work with certain partners for a specific few, and I would say for us we use agile development, and I've found that to really be kind of the best way to stay completely in tune with the ever-shifting dynamic needs of consumers, and the things you don't expect, the new product announcements, the new devices, as a way that helps you plan, in effect, and deliver in small increments. It's really the best way to make that happen.
Yeah, something I've noticed is integrating a discovery phase into development, where you can explore those new technologies before committing to the organization that you're actually going to be able to build them, because I think sometimes things theoretically sound possible, and then when you get into the weeds, there's just some reason why it can't be done or needs to be different. How have you dealt with this?
So it's interesting, to touch on what John just said, using the partnerships that we've had with both our applications, professional services like Globant, for example, and allowing them to work with our teams and learning and evolving with them has opened up our minds and our abilities. Also, how we structure our arrangements is very important. If we build in capacities of agile story points and we build a capacity, people aren't looking at the incremental story point build, they're actually looking at the entire epic and an entire story, let's say. And I think that's been able to, we've been able to sort of reinvent ourselves in a very agile fashion, like John mentioned, in a more of a iterative and a day-to-day fashion.
It makes sense looking at the epic, because maybe what is being requested isn't literally what will deliver, but when you understand the intention of that feature or experience, we may be able to find a better way or a more realistic way to deliver on that.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. Brian?
My turn, yeah. We at Warner Brothers try to use a very aggressive, rapid prototyping process, get things into pilot as soon as possible. And the first pilot we do is what we call the tech feasibility pilot to see if it'll even work. And in that way, we can filter out the things that are going to be challenging or impossible and not spend as much time on the dead-end streets, rather getting us to the productive tracks and getting things to market.
That's great. I'm sure we'll be dealing with this forever, and hopefully we can share notes on how to be better at it.
Sure.
So the next question is really about aggregated networks versus branded applications. I think we're seeing this tug of war between, services like Hulu, where you can integrate HBO, and it's a one-stop shop. But then we also have branded experiences, like maybe Red Bull TV, which is very curated, very much about the brand, and the brand controls that experience. And I see this tug of war between the two. I know as a user, I love that one-stop place to get everything I love. But as a product guy, I want to create that bespoke experience that is unique and not like anything else. Where do you think the future of applications is going?
I'll start out, sure. I think it's a great question, especially in the media space.
Yeah.
And I feel like if you go back years, all of the studios and networks, by and large, were really means of delivering content, usually to someone else who was directly connected to the consumer, right? And their customers, ultimately, at the end of the day, it was viewers, but really their customers were, pay TV distributors or advertisers. And obviously that's all changed. And to me now, the networks and studios that are winning are the ones who are building those kind of direct consumer applications, understanding their real users, getting the data from all of that. And as it relates to kind of aggregation, absolutely that is going to be the way forward for content, no doubt about it. But it is equally important to make sure that you've got some means of connecting directly to the consumer. So I think it's going to be both. And for Epics, we today are primarily focused around the pay TV space. And frankly, as the fastest growing pay TV network, we still have quite a bit of growth there. But we also work closely with other digital aggregators, whether it's Sony View or Hulu or Amazon. And then, of course, we've heavily invested in having that direct consumer experience. And just as you said, you have that one place that you like to go for your content. For everyone, it's going to be something different, typically.
That's a good point. Brian?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to just talk from an HBO perspective. So
Please.
obviously per channel or per brand is important because of the history of that brand and how it's delivered. If you look at HBO, for example, there's a linear, there's an SVOD, which is video on demand. Then you have your HBO Go, which is the subscription base, and then HBO Now, which is the over-the-top. The branded content still is important to the producers and the directors of the content, those that are actually producing these shows, Game of Thrones or Silicon Valley or whatever. It's very important that you keep up that brand because that's what brought them in to begin with. If you aggregate everything, you could unwittingly lose your relationship with the directors and the producers, and ultimately that content production quality is still what they're looking for. So if the overall experience of the aggregation is improperly done, or if the ecosystem is difficult to manage or to sort of matriculate your way through, you're not going to go to the content. So then all the data that John just mentioned, which is really critical, we don't gather that because it's still, A, it's aggregated, B, people aren't using the product. So we find that to be challenging, especially with the linear combination and then also the on-demand side.
Yeah. I think it's interesting from the artist's point of view. I don't think I've really thought about it that way, how they care about their content and how it is presented to the user.
Especially long-form content.
Yeah.
When you have your, the inside the show afterwards, if you aggregate everything in a templatized format without the allowance for those additional programs, the producers and directors won't want to come back to you and do shows with you again.
Very much makes sense. Brian?
We certainly see the allure of the platforms. You know, the big disruptors to our industry, Amazon and Netflix come to mind, have built these platforms that are worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and they've built those platforms largely on the backs of our content. You know, what makes Netflix worth watching, or what draws consumers to Amazon, you know, the use of the Hollywood film and TV content. So we are, of course, working very hard to try and create these direct-to-consumer engagement channels. The difficulty is it's not our historic DNA, right? You know, we market to consumers, but we sell B2B. That's the way a studio works. You know, we sell to Amazon, we don't sell to Robbie. So we're having to reinvent ourselves, and the jury's still out. Well, like I said, we're working hard, we're putting a lot of resource to it, but I don't have the answer for you yet.
Well, it's interesting, directly to the consumer, maybe there is an opportunity for that. With purchasing, that could be a solution, but I don't know. I mean, we users are too, they expect that curated discovery experience almost as much as being able to directly get what they want. I think the browsing is in our nature. It's like going back to the old video store experience. There's something fun about, you know, maybe sitting together with your family and going through the catalog to choose what you will be experiencing together. So, you know, we are the builders. We're the ones who are actually creating the technology and user experiences. And there are different options for how we can do that. There are very bespoke type of applications where we create from the ground up the entire user experience and how the user interacts with not just the content but the brand. And then there are more out-of-the-box solutions which can be much more affordable and get you into market much faster. There are also other technologies that you can either build, bolt, or buy. It's a common term of how do you feel about owning your own IP and being a part of the building and doing it internally versus maybe having third parties build your applications for you? Let's start with Brian.
All right, we'll reverse course. It's always great to own your own IP. And if you look at the history of Hollywood, when we've gotten that right, I'm thinking of the DVD format, it's been enormously valuable and lucrative, particularly to Warner Brothers, because we did own a lot of the patents that go into the DVD. It's not always the right answer, though, to hold up the development of a standard for IP concerns, because really what we do is we sell movies, and we need to get to market and sell those movies. And if we're busy fighting with Disney and Sony et al. over IP, then we're not selling movies. So there has to be a balance that we strike there. It's a tightrope. We get it right sometimes. I named an example there. Sometimes we get it wrong. You know, Ultraviolet is an example of that.
Yeah, that's a good example.
So 2 points to touch on what Brian just mentioned. So it's fairly easy to say, are you a media company or a tech company? And based on that answer, this is what you should do. But I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you can potentially be a media company but own your own IP, provided you structure, again, I'll go back to the way you structure your agreements if you do outsource that activity. If you structure it where you're both gaining from that IP, and what I mean by that is if you white label it, which is I'm not sure if people know what the term means, but basically you own the IP and then the provider owns that part and then he distill that and you give the part back to the company. And then they monetize it on their own and they help you update your, so there's a way to do it where you can own your own IP but yet benefit from the advantages or the advancements of that by a third party. So it's a potential possibility. For us, potentially that was, I always think that you shouldn't let your own hubris or your own arrogance get in the way of what your core competency is. Too often we get technologists who, and I'm one of them, I'm part of the problem maybe, but we get in our own way because we want to build it ourselves and we want to be the first to market. And frankly, there's no reason to do that when you can potentially monetize it with somebody else's IP. So, and faster. And so that's, that's kind of where I sit on that.
John?
Sure. I think it's always an interesting question, and the way we've addressed it at Epix, I would say, is very much akin to kind of what I went through in the days when I was, running my own startup. And we look at sort of the spectrum of technology and say to ourselves, what is the IP that really matters to us, that we feel like we need to have our fingers on, that ultimately is going to help us kind of drive the business, and focus on really either building that ourselves with our own employees or contractors, and then we'll look to have other companies kind of work with us almost as extensions of our core team. And then where we look for like straight up just off the shelf purchasing are usually kind of at the two ends of the spectrum. Either something that's such a commodity, it's not worth building, or something that's so highly specialized that it just simply wouldn't be worth our time and resource to try to replicate it. Probably wouldn't be able to do it as good as those specialists who've maybe invested hundreds of millions of dollars per se in terms of building it correctly. So generally I'd say that's the kind of wheel of evaluation that we go through in making some of those decisions.
If I could just add to all those thoughts, I think a value of making either decision or something in between is to understand what is going on, understand that technology, not let all that knowledge go away or be with the third party. I think if you are able to document the learnings along the way, that you become stronger and smarter as you're making decisions for your products.
Yeah.
Another thing from the future or the now is this virtual reality thing. And when we think about virtual reality and the distribution of virtual reality, there's so many choices for the user in the home, but we're now seeing these places pop up in malls. And in Los Angeles, we have IMAX just opened up a VR theater, which is amazing. If you're out there, you have to experience this. So when we think about distributing this type of content, where do you think it's going to happen? Is this going to be in the home? Is this going to be in the theater? Is this going to be somewhere in the middle? What is the future of VR distribution? Or Heath, you want to jump in on this one?
So exciting. I'm so excited about this. I'm a sports fan. I can't wait to see a football game in the eyes of a quarterback on the field. It's fascinating. To answer your question, and then I'll take a step forward on that. I believe it's going to be in the home. I think this personal, we saw it with computing. It became personal computers. We saw it with gaming from arcades into the home with PlayStations. So majority of times it does actually shift, and everybody here who has kids knows that the kids want to play it in their house and be with their friends and whatnot. So I think that's where I see this heading. But I think it's from a technology point of view, and I'll take it two angles: technology point of view, and then also production quality. The technology point of view, I think, is already established, but you have to have the scalability of things like cloud architecture and things like that to store all that excessive or additional content that you need to produce this. But again, back to the production qualities thing. If you're HBO or you're Warner Brothers or you're Netflix and you have a brand identity, the producer of that content is going to want to make sure that they understand what you're planning to do with that content. And they can't change the storyline, or they can't change the arcs and the denouements of the story if you're doing all this other stuff with VR. So you have to be conscious of that too. But absolutely, the most exciting thing for media I was going to say in a long time, but in the last 6 months.
I totally agree. John, what do you think?
I love it. I mean, I always think back on sort of my first kind of VR experience, right? And the first time, I'm sure everyone here has probably gone through that, but like the first time you do it and it's like your eyes just open up. You're like, man, this is incredible. And I think, to me, maybe this is a bit of a non-answer, but I feel like the experiences are going to largely track what is going on with movies and home theater or gaming, where the idea is that what you're going to have in your house is probably going to be still pretty amazing, whether it's something that's a head-mounted display or even 360 video on mobile. That's going to give you a certain set of experiences. We actually had a really great experience that we launched last year around our show Berlin Station. If anyone checked it out, it's actually still available online. But we had the first interactive 360 video experience that could be done on any mobile device. So even the iPhone Safari, you could get a full, not only 360 video experience, but it was interactive as well. And to me, I think the phone actually is going to represent, especially with what Apple has done and Google continues to do with AR, I think that's going to be a whole paradigm. That said, people will go to special locations for an experience that is so far beyond what they can get in their house, because it's going to have the headsets that are the latest and greatest that are not even possible to get down to a price point for a consumer. And it's going to have practical effects. And they have, places like these already, even in Times Square, where you're going to get that ultra immersive, highly realistic experience that is worth paying for and worth kind of leaving your house for. So I really kind of see it along that spectrum.
Right?
The historical precedent of 3D would suggest that it'll be an out-of-home experience. 3D in the home never took off for a variety of reasons. Consumers weren't willing to fiddle with the glasses or whatever the problems were. And so that suggests definitely a location-based future, theatrical exhibition, theme parks, the VR roller coasters that hopefully you've experienced. That's a lot of fun, and things like that. One of the things that we're intrigued by, though, is the idea of a virtual exhibitor, taking AMC and Regal and Cinemark and that capital-intensive business of theirs, where they build bricks and mortar theaters and they put seats in them, and those seats sit empty, 99% of the time, every hour of every day. It's a rare weekend event that you get that seat filled. And trying to up the utilization by placing a headset in your home and in your home and in your home and in your home, and then selling you a theatrical ticket there. Haven't ironed out all the kinks, but we've been approached by a number of different entities with this concept, and we think it has some merit if the economics can be worked out. We can get the theatrical business back on its feet by solving that problem of the capital investment. So we've got some exciting business model thinking going on around VR, not just the product thinking that is also very exciting.
It'll be interesting to watch how IMAX goes and all these pop-up experiences. I'm sure the data is being collected heavily right now. Let's see here. So
let me jump back
yes,
on
please.
that. The reason we're excited about that is with the headset, it's a pay-per-viewer model, just like a theatrical experience. It's not a pay-per-view where I can fill up my living room with all of you guys, right? So the economics are really clean. So I'm sorry, we're kind of excited about that one.
No,
Don't know
makes
if it'll
sense.
go there, but I wanted to throw that
Well,
out.
and I'll take it one step further, because then you have more data on that individual based on the choices they've made. And that is essentially, and how you monetize that is a critical factor in the future evolution of what we produce and what potentially Warner Brothers would do from a theatrical standpoint.
I guess you could get the data from both, from those mobile experiences as well as the theater experiences. And I wonder how groups will, and like multiplayer type of experiences. Will you be going like laser tag, where you go with a group to these rooms and escape the room kind of experiences are really popular right now. And I almost imagine there'll be a hybrid of virtual reality and escape the room type of things coming in the near future. I think that'd be really fun. And talking about data, we struggle with users. I mean, we talked about this earlier, that, do people trust giving their data away? And I've always thought, I know why we're using it. I know that we don't necessarily even care who you are. We just want to deliver you a better ad so I can make more money. I don't think we educate users well on that. And I think that it's ambiguous, and I think, again, trust. I know that's been a theme of the day. Why do you think there's a better way that we can educate users to provide that information to us so we can provide a more curated, personalized experience, whether it be content or advertising? Brian, you want to jump in?
We have to do a better job of telling the what's in it for the consumer story. If you think about instances in which consumers do give away their data freely, Facebook, how much data do you give to Facebook in exchange for using Facebook? It's shocking how much you give to Facebook, and yet when we try to get some data, you're reluctant. What is Warner Brothers going to do with that data? That might be weird. They might sell it. There are all these questions that come up, and I believe that that's because we haven't yet told the story of what we're going to do to make your life better if you give us that data. Facebook has a really clear story. You know what? Yeah, we're taking all your data, and what we're doing to make you better is giving you this platform where you can post stuff with all your friends and, in fact, the whole world. We need to get closer to that story if we want to win consumers' hearts and win their data.
John?
Sure. For me, when I think of data and trust, what comes to mind first is around recommendations. And I feel like, this idea, not, thinking about themes like AI, for instance, but this idea that there's this algorithm that's going to look at what you've watched or indicated an interest in watching on a service and now use that to then inform recommendations. I feel like, unfortunately, there have been some products out there in this area. Oop, I think I just realized I had a mic. There was I think a few players that maybe came to the space and frankly somewhat polluted it by making it seem like they were providing recommendations, but in fact it was pretty clear that perhaps it was just pushing original content or things like that I think honestly devalued personal recommendations for a lot of people. And so the way that we're looking at this is, we have all of the metadata and we focus on it. We tag our content with literally hundreds of tags, and we have this algorithms in place, but we also have people and people who can bring kind of that human curation touch. And our feeling is by combining the two, hopefully we extend the trust. And there's a sense that maybe things I'm starting to see are probably more along the lines of what I want to watch, but there's always this sort of human curation element to it, so it doesn't just feel like a machine. And I think maybe there's something to take away there as well in terms of combining that personal kind of human touch with kind of the algorithmic data-driven side.
I agree.
Can we mix in a crowdsourcing type of dynamic? Think of a successful recommendation engine, Rotten Tomatoes, in the film business. The success of it is because it's crowdsourced and therefore more trusted than pure critical reviews.
Oh, definitely. I think YouTube may have a good example there with what's trending and what's popular and with, combined with what you've said you like. I think it has a lot to do with onboarding too. I think if we ask for information at key points where it shows the value, it's not just a list at the beginning of the experience or somewhere you go, but when you're about to engage with the feature and it asks for a piece of information that will then benefit that particular feature, it may add context to why we're asking that kind of question.
Yeah, I'll just
No, go ahead.
I'll just add one thing, because everything, I concur with what my colleagues here have said, but a little spin on it for us is, we go through our MVPDs, our affiliates for our distribution channels, right? So they have an objective and clear understanding of what we would do with that potential data, so they don't provide that to us. Comcast, Dish Network, what have you. So we don't actually get all the data. So when we do ask, the consumer sometimes is wondering, well, I don't know who this data is going to be used for. So again, just to touch on the education part, it's critical, and I think you said it too as well, Robbie, that the data has to be a clear articulation of why we're doing it and what we're doing it, and at a point where, and not to use the word vulnerability, but when you're most vulnerable because you're willing to, based on the product that you're going to watch, yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, I'll give them the data. I know what they're going to do with it.
Because it makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I use the word vulnerable, but that's probably not the right word choice. But that's kind of where I'm thinking about.
That's great. So this next one is a fun question. I was excited about this because there have been a lot of innovations over time, and as product guys, we have to think about what is. It may not be popular today, but what is the bet for the future? And when we think about all of those features or products or innovations that we've seen over the last decade or longer, I would have bet on some that didn't make it, actually. And I look back at the ones that I thought, wow, that one's totally going to take off, and then nothing. Or I look back and going, well, what was I even thinking? So I'd love to hear what were some of those innovations that you loved but totally failed commercially. Rohit, you want to start with this?
So the first app I ever bought on my iPhone was an app that told me what the state of a public restroom was in New York City. No, that's not the one. It did fail, but that's not my story.
But that's a good one.
That's useful.
Oh, super useful. And the ones that were unlocked, and I didn't have to buy something to use the restroom. Anyway, it's a long story. The one that I always, what came to mind first, Robbie, when you asked me that was Napster. So I wrote that on my thing because Napster's peer-to-peer technology and their DRM capabilities were, at the time, so far advanced. It was incredible. But the connotation of what they were doing, even after they were, legitimized, they were done. So I think that generally is tops in my mind as what could have been and what could they have done. But they kind of, they could have reinvented the game before iTunes did it, but
Totally.
they were sort of poor in terms of form.
John,
It's one of those cases where it was a bit of a technology that got ahead of where the business was.
Yeah,
that happens a lot.
That's a common theme, yeah.
Yeah, the business paid a price for that too.
yeah.
That's right.
In that particular case.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm going to have to go with Google Glass. And I tell you, I went to the MIT Media Lab with the guys behind a lot of that technology, guys like Steve Mann. And when it first came out, I was so excited. And I was ready for those Warby Parker Google Glass. Remember those?
Yeah.
Never happened. And of course, it failed. But I still need something that, when I go to a cocktail party is going to remind me of who everybody is. Still waiting for that. So hopefully someone
I'm
will get it
sure
right.
that will happen. Definitely. Brian, what's your?
Yeah, mine is second screen commerce, the shop the show thing.
Definitely.
In my heart, I've just always felt like it's the perfect way to help you find what you want. If you see it on your show, can't you just grab it? And we've seen all sorts of attempts to do that, and it just never takes with consumers. I've been a part of attempts to do it at two different companies, and in both cases we had great IP, great shows going, Friends or The Devil Wears Prada or something like that, and beautiful apps, and we just couldn't get consumers to download and engage. I still haven't cracked that code, but it still feels to me like something that ought to be really cool, the old buying Jennifer Aniston sweater thing.
Well, don't give up. I have a feeling something will happen in the future.
We'll find a way.
There's going to be a way. There'll be something there. I'd love to chime in mine. I was thinking about this conference and being at other conferences, and I remember Bump, which was one of the first apps that ever came out, and I just can't believe that never took off. We still use business cards. And why didn't LinkedIn buy them? I don't get it. I think that was something that it would make life much easier. But as far as augmented reality for these types of events, we will definitely have, I'm sure we will have a future where we're seeing everyone's LinkedIn hovering above each other's heads.
That's going to happen.
At some point, guaranteed.
Yeah.
We can all be mentalists.
Oh, there you go.
Or the,
You know what? I think he might have something.
we'll have our Uber rating on top of our heads.
They'll just keep driving by. Well, that's great. Well, I really appreciate this, guys. Really interesting stuff. I'd love to open it up to the room for questions. These are the guys building the stuff, thinking about the future, iterating on those features. So if you guys have any thoughts or you'd like to share any questions. Yes?
Yeah, I'd love to get your thoughts on piracy and how you're fighting that. And are you using any intelligent systems to do that? Since I know, I get reminded every time I see a movie that it's a huge problem in the industry. I only know because you tell me, but I promise. But I'd love to get your thoughts on how you're combating it.
Yeah. It's a fine line between combating it and working with the nice people who enjoy our content. We don't want to go music and file a bunch of lawsuits against our customers. We saw the failure there. And when we look at this, and we look at it in great detail, we find that there's a somewhat muted economic impact of piracy. A lot of the piracy is free-seeking behavior perpetrated by people who just don't have the money or they weren't going to spend the money. So that's why you see the response you get from us, which is we put copy protection on there so that we have legal protection and we can step in when Kim.com creates Mega Upload or Pirate Bay or whatever he creates. And we can attack those big, obvious, distribution weaknesses, but we're not generally in the same mindset that we were 10 years ago, where we'd sell a digital version of a movie and it was literally one download locked to a single PC, and it just wasn't useful to consumers. Now you see when we sell you a digital right, there's a lot of portability in with that, and yes, there's some vulnerability that comes along, but first and foremost, we have to satisfy you as a consumer. So we're trying to strike that balance. Would be my answer from Warner Brothers.
I think the industry's evolved significantly in the last 5 years, especially you mentioned digital rights management. The industry has actually locked that down to just a few platforms now for your SDKs. So there's not this open-ended DRM strategy that you have to figure out internally. Just 5 years ago, there was at least 6 that I could name off the top of my head that we had to maintain and support under various platforms, right? So Android, iOS, various things. So that was a huge, you have to staff that, and you have to constantly learn and be ahead of that. So that's helped, I think, a lot. For HBO, which I can speak more about, I think our CEO said we're trying to create addicts. That's not to say that we are okay with people stealing Game of Thrones, which is the most pirated show in the history of television. But if that helps the monetization of our products, if we're trying to sell DVDs, electronic sell-throughs, and other manners, and when we're trying to create that addiction to the program so that when you do have the money, to Brian's point, to subscribe legally, that you would subscribe another couple of months that you ordinarily would not have. And so now you've created this addiction that it's really difficult to sell it to our production companies and our production houses because they want to understand their consumer better. But yeah, I mean, from a technical point of view, it's just getting better. And then from a business standpoint, it seems to work for us at HBO.
I would just say, I mean, from our standpoint, I mean, we use kind of all of the industry standard means of encryption and DRM, et cetera. So I'm not as close to that piece, but I would say that just like we were talking about Napster before, I think all of the same rules apply to film and television in that you've got effectively technology that I think has gotten a few steps ahead of business models. And one of the hottest topics I'd say right now, certainly in the film industry, is the idea of day and date. And the reality is that people have had day and date for quite a while. It's just that they weren't paying anything for what they got then. And this is a case where I think there's ways to solve these problems with technology, but in many cases, a lot of it has to do with providing people what they want at the right price point on the right device. And I think until the industry kind of gets there, we're just going to continue to see piracy from the people who can't have exactly what they want.
John, I think you just summed up this whole panel that we're talking about technology that's gotten ahead of the business models. And that's not just with piracy, that's with all the stuff we're talking
really great
about.
point.
And I could, if you guys come up to me later, I can go on about this. There's a lot of problems that I wrestle with at Warner Brothers where the business models are behind the tech, and it's taking our monetization like way below optimal. And so we have to solve that, and I think the best way to do that is to try and keep up and in fact be ahead of the game with the technology rather than letting it run off ahead of us and catch us in that situation, that silly situation I described a second ago where we used to sell digital downloads that were locked down to a single PC and you didn't buy it because it was useless to you, right? We've got to really up our game and get faster and more agile with our use of technology so that we can be the ones innovating on our business models as opposed to having disruptors innovate on our business models and then we pay the price.